Hey everyone, welcome to our tutorial on switch statements in C#. Before we begin coding, let's talk a little bit about switch statements and their relationship to if statements and why you might prefer one over the other. So let me start a comment here and we'll say if statements and I'll leave a little note. So if statements are good for evaluating some Boolean expression. That expression can be complex or simple, meaning that expression can have a bunch of different smaller expressions inside of it, or it can be as simple as passing in a Boolean variable even. So that if statement just needs a true or false value. But it's really good for evaluating complex or simple Boolean expressions, and then executing the code that's associated with that. If you have else ifs, they can do the same thing. If you have an else block, it catches all of the all of the conditions that aren't caught in the ifs and the else ifs. So now, on the other hand, a switch statement is really only good for one specific situation, but it's really easy to read and it's really efficient for this one situation. And that situation is a switch statement is good for comparing an unknown variable to a set of known constant variables. So this situation happens more than you might think when you're coding. So switch statements are pretty common. I would say if statements are more common, but switch statements are still something you should definitely know. So a switch statement is good for comparing an unknown variable to a set of known variables. And those variables have to be constant. Constant meaning those variables cannot change. So a constant variable is a variable that does not change. So I'll show you how to write a switch statement now. Starts off with the keyword switch, as you might have guessed, and you have your open and close parentheses followed by your open and close curly braces in the same way that you do with an if statement. So inside of this, this is a different way of writing a comment. So inside these parentheses, I'm going to pass in the unknown variable, right? So this is not an expression. This is an unknown variable. And so once we pass in our unknown variable into the switch statement, we go into the scope of it. And inside the scope is where we compare the unknown variable to the set of known variables. And you do that by using the keyword case. And so with this case keyword right next to it, you put one of your known constant variables. So you put one there, and then below it, you put your instructions that you want to execute. And then you have to finish this by using the keyword break. So you pass in your unknown variable here. We go into the scope of the switch statement. The computer sees that you have the case keyword followed by a known constant variable. The computer is smart enough to know that when these two things are together, it will just compare the unknown variable to the known variable. And if that comparison is true, it'll execute the instructions below. And so you can do this as many times as you want. And it's very simple and easy to read, which is why people like it. Now, after you run through all of your cases of checking your unknown variable to your known variable, if none of those cases are true, then you can write this default keyword And the default keyword is kind of like the else block of your if statement. It catches anything that falls through, and it'll execute your general instructions here. General meaning they don't apply to any specific case, because if it applied to a case, we would have caught it already. So you execute your general instructions, and then you use your break keyword here. So this is the format of a switch statement. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all these comments, and let's actually create a set of constant variables that we can use in our switch statement. So now to create a constant variable, you start out with the keyword const, then you put in the type string or whatever type it is that you want, and then you put in your variable name. I'm going to call this user1, and I'll assign it to Pete. So you'll see that a const variable declaration, an assignment here, is the same as a normal one, except we have this const keyword. If we deleted the keyword, this still works. So if you just put const in front of a variable, it makes it so that variable can't change. Later on, when you try to assign user1 to something, we want to assign it to be, Dave. We can't do that. You see it throws an error here, this red squiggly line. And it says under the left-hand side of an assignment must be a variable, property, or indexer, meaning this is a constant. We can't touch this value. So I'm going to create a few more of these. And we'll go through. Okay, so we have our set of known constant variables. These variables are not going to change. We have a list of them. We're not a list, but we have our set. So now let's get our unknown variable. So I will call our unknown variable unknown input, and we will set this input to be equal to our console.readline. So this will be equal to user input. Cool. So now we have our set of known variables, or known constants. We have our unknown variable, and so now we can put these into the switch. I'm going to delete this comment so things are less cluttered. So in our switch statement, we pass in an unknown variable. So obviously for us, that will be unknown input. Cool, that works. Now we need to check our known constant variables. So I'll put in our first known constant variable, which is user1. And for the instruction that we execute, I will do a console.writeLine, and we will say, this is user1. And I'm going to copy that and paste it down for the rest of our instructions when the time comes. So now we have our user1 case. Now let's go down to our second case. We'll put in user2. And if our unknown input is equal to user2, which is Dave, then let's print out this is user2, and then we'll break. Now for our third case, we will pass in user3, and I'll delete this, and then this is user3. I guess we have a fourth username there, so we will paste this in for user4, and then I'll check Wen's name. We'll put in this as user4, and if we can't find that user in our set of known users, we'll say not in user set. Cool. Okay, so that was a lot of coding. We have our set of known variables. We have our unknown variable, which is going to be user input. We'll take our unknown input, we'll pass it into our switch, and we'll compare it to each of our variables in the set. So you can see when I click on the variable, it highlights it up here. Awesome. So let's run this. And so it's waiting for us to enter our name because I forgot to put in a greeting. That's fine. We'll just roll with it and we'll put in the name Simone. We'll hit enter and see if it compares it to Simone. If it does match our input to the Simone constant up here, we should see a console printout that says this is user 3. I'll hit enter, and this is user 3. So you can see it's going through and checking to each one, and then writing out this is user 3. Let's try it again. I'm going to close the terminal. We'll run it again, and we'll put in a different username. Let's put in Pete and hit enter. This is user 1, and that all makes sense because it compared it to this. This is user 1. Perfect. So now let's go through and we will give it a name that's not on the list. We'll give it the name Barry. And Barry, of course, is not in our set of known constant variables, so we know that it doesn't, it's not going to find it. Awesome. One last thing. Let's remove, if we remove a break from this, we can also remove the instruction, and this case will just trickle down into the default case. I don't recommend doing this because it can lead to issues that are hard to track down and hard to spot, but it is an option if you ever want to do it. So we'll run this. And in this situation, case 4 is when. So if we put in when, it should say that this is not in our user set. Even though he is, this case will trickle down into this because we don't have a break keyword and we don't have instructions. So let's hit enter, and yes, we see that it does trickle down. So that's sort of the long and short of how to use a switch statement.